My name is David Mitchell, and I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand that miracles don't always look like what we expect them to. Sometimes they come disguised as ordinary moments, in ordinary places, when we least deserve them and least expect them to find us. I was 34 years old when my world fell apart. Not in the dramatic way you see in movies, with explosions and sirens and hospital beds. No, my world crumbled slowly, like old mortar between bricks, until one day I looked around and realized there was nothing left holding me together. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. It was October in Cleveland, Ohio, and the leaves had turned that deep amber color that makes you think of endings. I'd been walking the same neighborhoods for weeks now, always at night, always alone. The streets of my childhood had become a maze I couldn't escape. Every corner held memories I didn't want to face. Every familiar house whispered reminders of the man I used to be. The smell of wood smoke drifted from chimneys as families gathered for dinner, their warm yellow windows glowing like promises I could no longer keep. My breath formed small clouds in the crisp air, and I pulled my jacket tighter, though the cold I felt had nothing to do with October's chill. It was the kind of cold that starts in your chest and spreads outward, numbing everything it touches. I used to be the guy people came to for advice. David Mitchell, the one with all the answers. The one who could quote scripture like poetry and make faith sound as natural as breathing. I'd grown up in Lakewood Baptist Church, raised my hand during every altar call until Pastor William stopped asking if anyone wanted to accept Jesus because he knew I'd already done it 17 times just to be sure. My father, Robert Mitchell, had been a deacon for 23 years. My mother, Sarah, taught Sunday school and could make a casserole appear at any family crisis faster than most people could dial 911. They'd raised me to believe that God had a plan, that everything happened for a reason, that prayer could move mountains and faith could heal anything. I believed it too. God, how I believed it. The sidewalk beneath my feet was cracked and uneven, forcing me to watch each step. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at something unseen. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to follow me, and I found myself checking over my shoulder, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. My apartment was 6 blocks away, but I wasn't ready to go home. Home meant silence. Home meant sitting alone with thoughts that circled like vultures, picking at the remains of everything I used to hold sacred. So I kept walking. Past the corner market, where Mrs. Chen still worked nights. Past the elementary school, where I'd learned to pray the Lord's Prayer. Past the park, where I'd kissed my first girlfriend and promised her that God would bless our love forever. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent half my life trying to get closer to God, and now I was spending the other half learning what it felt like when he walked away. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably my mother again, leaving another voicemail that started with, "Honey, I know you're hurting, but," and ended with an invitation to dinner that I wouldn't accept. How could I sit at their table, bow my head while Dad said grace, and pretend I still believed in the God who blessed our food while children starved on the other side of the world? The questions had started small, whispers in the back of my mind during particularly long sermons. Why did good people suffer? Why did prayers go unanswered? Why did God seem so present in church and so absent everywhere else? But questions have a way of growing in the dark, feeding on doubt until they become something too big to ignore. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating my face before disappearing around the corner. For a moment, I saw my reflection in a shop window, hollow cheeks, beard growing unkempt, eyes that looked like they belonged to someone much older. When had I started looking like a man who'd given up? The night air carried the scent of rain, though the forecast had called for clear skies. I tilted my head back and looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city's glow. Once upon a time, I would have seen God's handiwork in that vast expanse. Now I just saw empty space, infinite and indifferent. My feet kept moving, following patterns I'd worn into these streets over the past month, right on Clifton, left on Madison, straight down Franklin, until I reached the old cemetery where Civil War soldiers slept under weathered headstones. Sometimes I'd stop there and read the inscriptions, wondering if those men had died believing in something greater than themselves, or if their faith had crumbled along with their bodies in some muddy field far from home. Tonight felt different, though I couldn't explain why. There was a weight in the air, a sense of anticipation that made my skin prickle. I found myself walking faster, as if I were late for an appointment I'd forgotten to make. My heart rate picked up, and I realized I was heading toward Lincoln Park, the small green space where I'd spent countless childhood afternoons swinging on rusted playground equipment and feeding ducks at the pond. The park was different at night. The cheerful daytime sounds, children laughing, dogs barking, joggers calling out friendly greetings, were replaced by the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant hum of traffic. Security lights cast harsh circles of white on the walking paths, leaving deep pools of shadow between them. I'd been here every night for the past week, though I wasn't sure why. Something kept drawing me back, some invisible thread that pulled me toward the old wooden bench near the pond. It sat alone under a flickering streetlight that never quite managed to stay steady, surrounded by oak trees that had witnessed decades of human drama. As I approached the familiar bench, my steps slowed. The metal plaque on the back read, "In memory of Eleanor Hartley, who found peace in simple moments." I'd read those words so many times they'd become a meditation, a reminder that peace was something people found, not something they were born with. I sat down heavily, feeling the day's exhaustion settle into my bones. The bench was cold through my jeans, and I could smell the musty scent of dead leaves and stagnant pond water. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called out, its voice lonely and questioning. This was where I came to think, to remember, to wrestle with the God who'd become a stranger. This was where I'd finally admitted to myself what I'd been denying for months. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back. The crisis had started with Emma. Emma Rodriguez had been 26 years old, with dark hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and a laugh that could fill any room. She joined our church 3 years ago, fresh out of graduate school and full of the kind of faith that makes older believers remember why they started believing in the first place. She asked hard questions during Bible study, volunteered at the soup kitchen every Saturday, and had a way of making everyone feel seen and valued. I'd been her small group leader, and watching her faith develop had been like watching a garden bloom. She prayed with the intensity of someone who believed God was actually listening. She talked about Jesus like he was her best friend. She'd been dating Marcus, a good man from the church, and they were planning a wedding for the following spring. The smell of disinfectant and artificial air freshener still haunted my memories. Hospital smells that clung to your clothes and followed you home, mixing with the scent of fear that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I could still hear the rhythmic beeping of machines, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors, the whispered conversations that stopped when family members walked by. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The words hit like a physical blow, leaving us all stunned and gasping. The doctor, a kind man with grey hair and tired eyes, had delivered the news with professional compassion, but the mathematics were brutal. Months, not years, maybe 6 if she was lucky. Emma had taken the news with a grace that shamed us all. "God has a plan," she'd said, gripping Marcus's hand while tears streamed down her face. "I don't understand it, but I trust him." The church had rallied around her like an army. Prayer chains that spanned 3 states, healing services where we laid hands and believed with everything we had, fundraisers for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. We fasted and prayed and quoted every healing verse in the Bible until our voices were hoarse and our knees were sore. I remembered the cold October morning when I'd knelt beside my bed at 5 a.m., hands pressed together so hard my knuckles turned white. "Please," I'd whispered into the darkness. "Not Emma. Take me instead. Take anyone else. She's got so much life ahead of her, so much good she could do for you." The silence that followed had been deafening. Emma had fought with everything she had: chemo that left her bald and nauseous, radiation that burned her skin, surgeries that carved pieces away while we hoped and prayed and believed. Through it all, she'd maintained her faith with a stubbornness that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "God is going to heal me," she'd tell visitors, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with conviction. "I can feel him working." Marcus had believed it too. We all had. How could we not? This was Emma. Beautiful, faithful Emma, who'd never hurt anyone and had given her life to serving others. If God was going to heal someone, surely it would be her. The park bench creaked under my weight as I shifted, trying to escape memories that followed me everywhere. The streetlight above flickered more violently now, casting dancing shadows on the dead grass around my feet. I could smell rain in the air, that metallic scent that comes before storms, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed its lonely song. I'd been with her at the end. Marcus had collapsed from exhaustion, and Emma's parents were flying in from Phoenix but wouldn't make it in time. She'd asked for me specifically. Her small hand surprisingly strong when she gripped my wrist. "David," she'd whispered, her voice like paper rustling in wind. "Tell me again about heaven." So I had. I'd painted pictures with words, describing golden streets and crystal seas, reunions with loved ones, and an eternity without pain or sorrow. I'd quoted Revelation and shared stories of near-death experiences I'd read about, anything to ease the fear in her eyes. But as dawn broke through the hospital window, casting pale light across her too thin face, Emma had looked at me with eyes that held a terrible clarity. "I can't feel him anymore," she'd breathed. "Where did he go?" I'd had no answer for her, no scripture verse that fit, no theological explanation that made sense. I'd just held her hand and watched the light fade from her eyes while machines beeped their electronic lullabies and nurses moved quietly in the hallway outside. She died at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday, while rain drummed against windows and the city woke up to another ordinary day. The last words she'd spoken were "why?", directed not at me, but at the ceiling, as if she could see through it to whatever lay beyond. A breeze stirred the leaves around the park bench, carrying the scent of dying things and the promise of winter. I pulled my jacket closer and tried not to think about Emma's funeral, about Marcus's broken sobs, about the way Pastor Williams had struggled to explain how losing someone so young was all part of God's mysterious plan. The questions had started immediately. If God was all-powerful, why hadn't he healed Emma? If he was loving, how could he let someone so good suffer so much? If prayer worked, why had our months of desperate pleading fallen on deaf ears? Maybe her healing wasn't physical, people had said. Maybe God called her home because he needed her in heaven. But what kind of God needs a 26-year-old more than her fiancé does? What kind of love takes away the very people whose faith shines brightest? The bench felt colder now, and I realized I'd been sitting here for over an hour. My hands were stiff with cold, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Across the pond, bare trees stood like skeletons against the orange glow of the city sky, and I could hear the distant sound of late-night traffic on the interstate. Emma's death had been the first domino to fall, but it hadn't been the last. 3 weeks later, the church had split over the pastor's decision to perform same-sex marriages. Half the congregation left, taking their tithes and their certainty with them. The soup kitchen had to close for lack of volunteers. The youth program shrank from 30 kids to 8. Then, my job had evaporated when the Christian non-profit I'd worked for lost its biggest donor. Apparently, even faith-based organizations weren't immune to economic reality. My savings disappeared into Emma's medical fundraiser, and my relationship with Jennifer had crumbled under the weight of questions she couldn't answer and doubts I couldn't hide. "You've changed," she'd said during our last conversation, standing in my doorway with tears in her eyes. "You're not the man I fell in love with." She was right. That man, the one who led Bible studies and organized mission trips and spoke at youth conferences about the power of faith, had died somewhere between Emma's diagnosis and her funeral. What was left was a hollow shell that looked like David Mitchell, but felt like a stranger wearing his clothes. The streetlight flickered one more time and then went out completely, plunging my corner of the park into darkness. Only the distant glow of other lights kept me from being swallowed entirely by the night. I should have felt afraid, sitting alone in a dark park after midnight, but fear required caring about what happened to you, and I'd lost that luxury weeks ago. Instead, I felt something else, a restlessness that had been building all evening. A sense that something was about to happen. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, and I found myself looking around the darkness as if expecting to see someone approaching. But the park was empty. Just me and the shadows and the weight of questions I couldn't answer. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. I stopped going to church first, then stopped returning phone calls, then stopped pretending I was okay when people asked. My apartment became my cave, a place where I could nurse my wounds and catalogue my grievances against a God who seemed to specialize in disappointment. The irony was that I knew the Bible better than ever. Desperate for answers, I'd read it cover to cover 3 times, hunting for explanations that made sense of Emma's death and the silence that followed every prayer. I'd found plenty of promises about healing, mountains being moved, and faith that could accomplish impossible things. But I'd also found Job's unanswered questions, the psalmist's complaints about God's absence, and Jesus himself crying out about abandonment from the cross. Which version was true? The God who promised to answer prayer, or the one who let good people suffer without explanation? My morning routine had become a ritual of numbness. Coffee black because adding cream seemed like too much effort. Toast dry because butter required caring about taste. News on the television because silence made the questions in my head too loud. Each day looked exactly like the one before it, a grey repetition of existence without purpose. The unemployment checks had stopped coming in November. I'd applied for dozens of jobs, but something in my eyes must have betrayed the emptiness inside, because interviews led nowhere and callbacks never came. My savings account dwindled like water in a leaky bucket, and creditors began calling with voices that mixed sympathy with determination. "Mr. Mitchell, we understand you're going through a difficult time, but, always but." The word that separated understanding from consequences, compassion from collections, empathy from eviction notices. My parents had tried to help, of course. Dad would show up with groceries and awkward small talk. His deacon's training making him approach my crisis like a broken church furnace, something that needed the right parts and proper maintenance to start working again. Mom brought casseroles and scripture verses written on index cards, weapons from her maternal arsenal deployed against problems she couldn't understand. "Honey, you just need to get back to church," she'd say, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my couch cushions while I stared at the wall. "Pastor Williams asks about you every Sunday." Pastor Williams, the man who'd baptized me at age 8, officiated my confirmation at 16, and recommended me for my first ministry position at 22. He'd called 6 times, texted twice, and finally showed up at my door on a rainy Thursday afternoon in December. I remembered the sound his umbrella made dripping in my entryway, like a clock counting seconds neither of us wanted to acknowledge. He sat in my kitchen chair, the same chair where Emma used to sit when she came over for Bible study, and folded his hands in the precise way that meant he was about to deliver pastoral care. "David," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years shepherding wounded sheep, "I know you're hurting. We all are. Emma was special to all of us. Special enough to heal." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I was past caring about tone. Pastor Williams had winced as if I'd struck him. "God's ways aren't our ways, son. Sometimes he calls our loved ones home for reasons we can't understand." "Don't." I stood up so fast the chair scraped against linoleum. "Don't give me platitudes. Emma didn't want to go home. She wanted to marry Marcus and have babies and teach Sunday school for the next 50 years. She died scared and confused and asking why God abandoned her." The kitchen fell silent except for the drip of rain against the window and the umbrella still counting time in the entryway. Pastor Williams looked older than his 68 years, his face lined with the accumulated weight of questions he couldn't answer and grief he'd absorbed from countless broken families. "I don't have easy answers," he'd finally admitted. "I wish I did. All I know is that turning away from God won't bring her back or make the pain stop. And turning toward him won't either." He'd left after that, taking his umbrella and his good intentions, and leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I was beyond help, at least the kind that came from church pews and prayer circles. Now, sitting on this park bench in the cold December air, I could smell snow coming. The scent was subtle but unmistakable. That clean, metallic smell that promised transformation, at least of the landscape. My breath came out in white puffs, and my fingers had gone numb despite my gloves. The pond in front of me had a thin skin of ice around the edges, and the ducks that usually gathered here had disappeared for the winter. Smart birds, I thought. They knew when to leave a place that couldn't sustain them anymore. I'd lost 15 pounds since Emma's death. Not from grief. Grief would have required emotional investment I no longer possessed, but from the simple mechanics of forgetting to eat. Food was fuel, nothing more, and I needed less fuel now that I wasn't going anywhere or doing anything that mattered. My sister Rebecca had driven down from Detroit the weekend before Christmas, her concern wrapped in cheerful determination that fooled no one. She'd cleaned my apartment, stocked my refrigerator, and sat me down for the kind of conversation that begins with, "I'm worried about you," and ends with threats of intervention. "You can't keep living like this," she'd said, perched on the edge of my couch like a bird ready for flight. "Mum and Dad are scared. We all are." Scared of what? She'd looked at me with eyes that held our father's intensity and our mother's compassion. "Scared you're going to disappear entirely. Scared we're going to lose you too. As if Emma had been family, which in all the ways that mattered, she had been. "I'm fine," I'd lied, the words as automatic as breathing. Fine people don't sit in dark apartments for weeks at a time. Fine people answer their phones. Fine people don't look like they've given up on everything that used to matter to them. She was right, of course. But rightness was a luxury for people who still believed truth and comfort could coexist, and I'd learned they were often strangers to each other. Rebecca had left me her spare key and a promise to check on me every few days. True to her word, she'd been calling and texting, each message a lifeline thrown to someone who'd forgotten how to swim. The park was quieter than usual tonight. Even the late-night joggers and dog walkers had apparently decided December in Cleveland was too cold for voluntary outdoor activities. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed too steady for someone whose world had collapsed. I'd read somewhere that hearts break, literally, not just figuratively. That extreme emotional trauma can cause actual cardiac symptoms, chest pain, irregular rhythms, a condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Broken heart syndrome, the medical community's acknowledgement that love and loss have physical consequences. but my heart kept beating with frustrating regularity, pumping blood through a body that continued functioning, despite having nothing left to live for. Even my cardiovascular system was more reliable than my faith had been. A police cruiser drove slowly past the park, its headlights sweeping across the walking paths. The officer inside probably saw me sitting here and made a mental note. Middle-aged white male, alone at midnight, potential problem to watch. I wondered what category I fit into in his experience. Homeless, mentally ill, dangerous, all of the above, maybe. The truth was, I'd become dangerous, at least to the version of Christianity I'd been raised on. Every Sunday school lesson I'd ever taught, every youth conference speech I'd given, every prayer I'd offered in public, all of it felt like lies now. Pretty stories told by people who hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be. How many people had I encouraged to trust in God's goodness? How many struggling believers had I reassured with promises about prayer and faith and divine love? How many Emmas had I helped create? People whose faith was so pure, it made them vulnerable to the kind of disappointment that destroys souls. The weight of that responsibility sat on my chest like a stone. I wasn't just losing my own faith, I was realizing that I'd been complicit in building others' faith on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of real tragedy. Snow began falling as I sat there, tiny flakes that looked like ash in the dim light from distant street lamps. They landed on my hands, my jacket, my hair, each one a small, cold kiss that melted immediately from body heat. Within minutes, a thin dusting covered the ground around my feet, transforming the brown decay of winter into something almost beautiful. I thought about Emma lying in her grave 3 miles away, under 6 feet of frozen earth and a headstone that read, "Beloved daughter, faithful servant, gone too soon." The snow would be covering her too, a blanket she couldn't feel over sleep she hadn't chosen. That was the thing about death that living people never really understood. It wasn't just the ending of a story, but the brutal interruption of all the stories that were supposed to come next. Emma's wedding dress still hung in her closet. Marcus's engagement ring still sat in its box on his nightstand. All the children they would have raised, all the people they would have helped, all the love they would have shared, erased by cells that multiplied when they should have stopped. And somewhere in the cosmic machinery of the universe, God had apparently looked at all of that potential and decided it was less important than whatever mysterious plan required a 26-year-old to die in agony, while people who loved her begged for mercy that never came. The snow fell harder now, and I realized I could no longer feel my feet. But I didn't want to go home. Home meant warmth and comfort, and I'd lost the right to either of those things. Instead, I sat in the growing cold and let the snow cover me like the earth had covered Emma, waiting for something I couldn't name but somehow knew was coming. By January, I had become invisible, not literally, but in all the ways that mattered to the world around me. Grocery clerks looked through me, bus drivers counted fare without meeting my eyes. Even my own reflection seemed insubstantial, like I was fading from existence one day at a time. The eviction notice had come on a Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who spoke with practiced kindness about deadlines and legal processes. 30 days, he'd said, though his eyes suggested he'd seen enough desperate people to know that sometimes 30 days might as well be 30 years. I'd called my parents from the courthouse steps, my breath forming white clouds as I spoke into my phone with fingers that shook from more than just cold. "Oh, of course you can come home," Mom had said immediately, her voice thick with relief that I was finally accepting help. "Your room is exactly like you left it." But I couldn't. The thought of sleeping in my childhood bed, surrounded by participation trophies and Sunday school certificates, felt like surrendering to a version of myself that no longer existed. How could I face my parents' hopeful faces across the breakfast table when I'd lost the faith that had shaped our entire family identity? Instead, I'd found a room in a boarding house on the east side, the kind of place where people paid by the week and minds their own business. My new neighbors were a collection of broken dreams and second chances. A veteran who talked to invisible enemies, an elderly woman who hummed hymns while chain-smoking on the porch, a young couple whose relationship played out in alternating shouts and apologies through paper-thin walls. The room was small and clean, furnished with the kind of furniture that had seen too many temporary residents. A single bed with a mattress that sagged in the middle, a wooden chair that wobbled when you sat down, a window that looked out at an alley where cats fought over garbage and rats scurried between dumpsters. But it was mine. In the way that desperate people claim spaces that offer nothing but solitude and the freedom to disappear without explanation. I'd found work washing dishes at a diner called Murphy's, the kind of place where coffee was always burning and the eggs came from a carton. The job required no experience, no references, and minimal human interaction. Perfect qualifications for someone who'd forgotten how to pretend everything was fine. My shift started at 5 a.m. and ended at 2 p.m. 8 hours of scalding water and industrial soap, grease stains and food scraps, the constant clatter of plates and the short-tempered orders of cooks who'd been working breakfast shifts since the Clinton administration. David, table 6 needs cleaning, or David, we're out of clean coffee cups, or just David, followed by whatever urgent task required immediate attention. My name had become a summons, stripped of personality or history. Just a sound that meant someone needed something done quickly and without questions. The work was numbing in exactly the way I needed. Physical exhaustion that made thinking optional. Routine so mindless, it required no creativity or decision-making. By the end of each shift, my hands were raw from chemicals and my back ached from bending over industrial sinks, but my mind was blessedly empty. I'd established a new routine in my new life, work, then a walk through whatever neighborhood I found myself in, lunch at a different fast food place each day, groceries from corner markets that sold expired food at discount prices, evening news in my small room, then the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than peace. And always, the walk to Lincoln Park. It had become a pilgrimage I couldn't explain, this nightly journey to sit on a bench and stare at water that reflected nothing but emptiness. The park was different in winter, stark and honest in the way that only leafless trees and frozen ground can be. No pretense of beauty, no false promises of spring, just existence stripped down to its essential elements. Tonight, the temperature had dropped below 0 and the pond was completely frozen. The ice looked thick enough to walk on, though signs warned against it in 3 languages. Even the homeless population that usually gathered near the warming shelter had found somewhere else to wait out the brutal cold. But I was here, as I'd been every night for weeks, drawn by something I couldn't name to this bench under a streetlight that flickered like a dying candle. My breath came out in white clouds that dissipated immediately, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket, my jeans, straight into bones that felt hollow and brittle. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no distant voices, no sound except the occasional crack of ice settling and the whisper of wind through bare branches. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. The fundamental loneliness of being human in an indifferent universe. I thought about Emma every night here, but tonight her memory felt closer, more immediate. Maybe it was the anniversary, exactly 3 months since she died, or maybe it was the cold that made everything feel more real. I could almost hear her voice asking the question that had haunted me since that morning in the hospital room. Where did he go? Where had he gone? The God who'd supposedly loved her, who'd received her prayers and her service and her unwavering faith for 26 years. The God who'd let her suffer through months of treatment that offered hope but delivered only pain. The God who'd been conspicuously absent when she'd needed him most. I'd stopped praying weeks ago, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. What was the point of talking to someone who either couldn't hear you or didn't care enough to respond? Even my parents had stopped asking if I was praying, probably sensing that the question caused more pain than comfort. The boarding house where I lived was full of people who'd given up on various dreams, but I was the only one who'd given up on God. My neighbors still crossed themselves when ambulances passed, still said "bless you" when someone sneezed, still invoked heaven when they talked about deceased relatives. Their faith might have been battered, but it hadn't been broken the way mine had. Maybe that was the difference between losing your job, or your marriage, or your health, and losing the person who'd embodied everything you believed about goodness and purpose. Emma hadn't just died, she'd taken my certainty with her, leaving me in a world where suffering was random and prayers were just words spoken into indifferent air. A police car drove past, slowing as the officer spotted me on the bench. Our eyes met through his windshield, and I saw him assessing the situation. Lone male, late at night, below freezing temperatures. Potential suicide watch or welfare check. But after a moment, he drove on, apparently deciding I looked more lost than dangerous. He wasn't wrong about either assessment. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Haven't heard from you in 3 days. Please just let me know you're alive." Alive. Such a simple word that had become complicated. Technically, yes, I was alive. My heart beat, my lungs processed air, my brain continued its basic functions. But the part of me that had once been capable of joy, hope, love, that part felt as frozen as the pond in front of me. I typed back, "I'm fine," then deleted it. Typed, "I'm here," then deleted that too. Finally settled on, "still breathing." It was honest, without being alarming, factual without inviting further questions. The cold was becoming dangerous now. I could no longer feel my toes, and my fingers were stiff even inside my gloves. But I wasn't ready to leave. Something kept me anchored to this bench, this moment, this precise point in space and time where my life had contracted to its smallest possible dimension. I thought about the sermon Pastor Williams would preach this Sunday. Probably something about perseverance in difficult times or the mysterious ways of God's love. The same congregation that had prayed so desperately for Emma's healing would sing hymns about trusting in divine goodness. And some of them might even mean it, but I wondered how many others were like me, going through the motions while their souls slowly starved, smiling at fellowship dinners while questions ate away at their foundations like termites in load-bearing beams. How many people sat in pews and pretended to believe because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate? The streetlight above me flickered more violently now, and I realized it might die entirely, leaving me alone in complete darkness. The thought didn't frighten me the way it might have once. Darkness, at least, was honest about what it was. But as the light struggled against whatever electrical fault threatened to extinguish it, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: curiosity. Not about anything profound or spiritual, just a simple wondering about whether the light would last through the night or surrender to the cold and the age of its components. It was such a small thing, this flicker of interest in an outcome that didn't matter, but after months of feeling nothing but emptiness, even mild curiosity felt like a miracle. The light flickered twice more, then steadied, as if deciding it wasn't quite ready to give up. And in that moment, sitting on a frozen bench in an empty park while my life lay in ruins around me, I made a decision. I would stay until morning. Whatever was coming, whether it was hypothermia, enlightenment, or just another ordinary dawn, I would wait for it here. I was tired of walking away, tired of running from questions that followed me anyway, tired of pretending that hiding could solve problems that lived inside my own skin. For the first time in months, I was going to stay put and see what happened next. Dawn was still 3 hours away when I felt the presence. At first, I thought it was hypothermia. My body had progressed through the stages of cold injury like a medical textbook. Shivering that eventually stopped, numbness that crept from extremities toward my core, a strange warmth that made me consider removing my jacket even though the temperature hadn't risen above zero all night. But this was different. Not the false warmth of a dying nervous system, but an actual presence that seemed to settle in the air around me like invisible breath. The hair on my arms stood up despite the cold, and suddenly I was more alert than I'd been in months. I looked around the park, expecting to see someone approaching, maybe another insomniac drawn to this frozen wasteland, or a security guard checking on the person crazy enough to sit outside all night. But the park was empty. Just me and the shadows cast by streetlights and the occasional car passing on the distant road. The presence grew stronger, more defined, until it felt like someone was sitting beside me on the bench, not crowding my space, just there, quiet and patient and somehow familiar. Though I couldn't place where I might have encountered it before. "This is it," I whispered to the frozen air. "I'm finally losing my mind." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Mental illness felt different from this. Madness was chaotic, unpredictable, divorced from reality. This presence was the most real thing I'd experienced since Emma's death, more solid than the bench beneath me, more immediate than the cold seeping through my clothes. I waited for fear, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt something I'd forgotten existed. Comfort. Not the shallow comfort of platitudes or false optimism, but the deep comfort of being truly seen and somehow, inexplicably, accepted. "I don't believe in you anymore," I said aloud, my voice barely audible in the stillness. The words formed white clouds that disappeared immediately, but they felt important to say. "I can't. Not after Emma." The presence didn't respond with words, but I felt something like understanding wash over me. Not judgment for my lack of faith, not disappointment at my failures, just acknowledgement. As if someone was saying, "I know. I understand why you feel that way." Tears started forming in my eyes. And I realized they were the first tears I'd cried since Emma's funeral. For months, I'd been dry inside, empty of everything including grief. But now the tears came hot and fast, melting the frost that had formed on my eyelashes and running down cheeks that burned from cold and emotion. "She believed in you," I choked out. "Right until the end, she believed. And you let her die scared and alone and asking why. What kind of love is that? What kind of God abandons someone like Emma?" The park remained silent, but the presence didn't diminish. If anything, it seemed to move closer, enveloping me in warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with being held. Not physically. I could still feel the cold, could still see my breath, but held in some deeper way that reached past my body to whatever part of me was capable of receiving comfort. And then, without audible words, but with perfect clarity, I heard, "I never left her, and I never left you." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, as natural as my own thoughts, but unmistakably other. It carried weight and texture, like remembering a song you'd forgotten you knew. And with it came images, not seen but somehow experienced, like memories that belonged to someone else. Emma in her hospital bed. Not alone, but surrounded by light I couldn't see with physical eyes. Emma's fear transformed into peace in her final moments, though it hadn't looked that way to those of us watching. Emma's death not as abandonment, but as homecoming, though we who stayed behind experienced it as loss. But she was afraid, I protested. I was holding her hand. I felt her fear. "Fear of the unknown isn't absence of faith," came the response. "And even I was afraid in the garden before the cross. Fear is human. Love is what carries you through it." More images then, flooding my consciousness like a dam breaking. All the moments I'd thought I was alone, walking these dark streets, sitting in my empty room, washing dishes in the steam and noise of the diner. But I hadn't been alone. The presence had been there, walking with me, sitting beside me, standing in the scalding water and soap suds, sharing every moment of pain and emptiness and questions that had no easy answers. Where were you when I needed to feel you? The question came out raw, desperate. Where were you when I was begging for some sign, some comfort, some reason to keep believing? I was in the silence, teaching you to hear beyond words. I was in the emptiness, making room for something deeper than the faith you thought you'd lost. I was in your doubt itself. Because doubt that wrestles with love is stronger than belief that never questions. I understood then, in a way that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to whatever part of me was capable of knowing without proof. The silence hadn't been absence, it had been invitation. The emptiness hadn't been abandonment, it had been preparation. Even my loss of faith hadn't been failure, it had been the painful shedding of a faith that was too small to contain the reality of God. Emma, I whispered, and I felt her, unmistakably her, laughing with the joy of someone who discovered that death was not an ending but a doorway. She was whole, complete, free from pain and fear and all the limitations that had defined her final months. More herself than she'd ever been able to be in a body that was failing. Tell Marcus I'm okay, her presence seemed to say, though not in words. Tell them all I'm okay. And David, thank you for staying with me. Thank you for holding my hand when I was afraid to let go. The tears were flowing freely now, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of being found after months of being lost. The cold that had threatened to kill me was still there, but it no longer mattered. I was being warmed from the inside out by a love so vast it made every earthly love seem like a pale reflection. I'm sorry, I sobbed. I'm sorry I stopped believing. I'm sorry I stopped praying. I'm sorry I blamed you for not being who I thought you should be. There's nothing to forgive. Your anger was honest, and honesty is the beginning of real relationship. You couldn't have found me in your strength. You had to find me in your weakness. You couldn't discover who I really am until you admitted who I am not. The streetlight above me, which had been flickering all night, suddenly blazed steady and bright. But even without it, I could see clearly now, not with my eyes but with some deeper perception. The park wasn't empty. It was full of presence, full of love, full of the kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances or understanding or having all your questions answered. I thought of all the nights I'd walked these streets, all the hours I'd sat on this bench, all the days I'd wandered through my meaningless routine, thinking I was alone. But I hadn't been alone. Every step had been shared, every breath had been accompanied, every moment of despair had been held in love that was patient enough to wait for me to stop running long enough to notice. The presence began to fade then, not leaving but settling into a quieter companionship, like a friend who sits with you in comfortable silence after an important conversation. Not gone, but no longer needing to speak. I sat there as the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the horizon with subtle shades of pink and gold. The cold was still dangerous, and I knew I needed to find warmth soon or risk serious injury. But for the first time in months, I felt ready to face another day. The park came back into focus around me, the frozen pond, the bare trees, the bench where I'd spent so many nights wrestling with questions too big for easy answers. But it looked different now. Not empty but expectant, not dead but dormant, waiting for spring to reveal life that had been there all along. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from cold and hours of sitting, and began the walk back to my small room. But I carried something with me now that I hadn't had when I arrived. Not answers, exactly, but something better. Presence. The knowledge that I wasn't alone, had never been alone, would never be alone. And Emma was okay. More than okay. She was home. Spring came early to Cleveland that year. Arriving in March with an unexpected warmth, that coaxed crocuses through the snow and filled the air with the scent of possibility. I was working in the kitchen at Murphy's when I noticed the change. Steam from the dishwasher mixing with fresh air flowing through open windows for the first time in months. "David, you're different," observed Marie. The head waitress, who'd worked there longer than the coffee machine had been broken, she was refilling napkin dispensers while I scrubbed the morning's breakfast plates. Our usual parallel routine that required few words but plenty of understanding. Different how? Can't put my finger on it. You smile sometimes now. Not often, but it happens. A few months ago, I wasn't sure you remembered how. She was right. Something fundamental had shifted that night in the park, like a bone setting properly after being broken. I still washed dishes, still lived in my small room, still wrestled with questions that didn't have neat answers, but I no longer felt like I was drowning in them. The presence I'd encountered hadn't magically solved my problems or restored the simple faith I'd lost. If anything, my relationship with God had become more complex, more honest, less dependent on getting what I prayed for, and more grounded in a love that didn't need my understanding to remain constant. I'd started attending a different church, a small Episcopal congregation that met in a converted warehouse and seemed comfortable with questions that didn't have easy answers. Father Michael was a Vietnam veteran who'd found his calling after losing his first one to Agent Orange and survivor's guilt. His sermons were less about certainty and more about wrestling with mystery, less about having God figured out and more about learning to dance with doubt. "Faith isn't the absence of questions," he'd said during my first visit. "It's the decision to keep walking, even when you can't see the path clearly, sometimes especially then." The congregation was a collection of people who'd been broken in various ways and found each other in the wreckage. Veterans with PTSD, divorced parents rebuilding their lives, recovering addicts counting days, elderly parishioners facing their mortality without flinching. We were too damaged to pretend everything was fine, too honest to offer platitudes instead of presence. I'd volunteered to help with the soup kitchen they ran on Saturdays, not from any grand sense of calling, but because I understood hunger, not just for food, but for dignity, for being seen as human, despite circumstances that suggested otherwise. The work was similar to what I'd done at Lakewood Baptist, but it felt different now, less like earning points with God and more like participating in something that mattered, whether God was keeping score or not. My parents had been cautious about my new church affiliation, worried that I was trading the solid theology of my upbringing for something they couldn't quite understand. But they'd also noticed the change in me, the way I no longer flinched when they mentioned prayer or looked away when they talked about faith. "I don't understand everything you believe now," my mother had said during our last visit, "but you look like yourself again, like you're inhabiting your own life instead of just surviving it." Rebecca had been more direct. "Whatever happened to you in those dark months, I'm glad you came through it. You scared us. I'd scared myself too, coming closer to the edge than I'd admitted to anyone, but the edge had turned out to be not an ending, but a beginning, a place where I'd finally stopped running from questions that couldn't be outmaneuvered and learned instead to live inside them. The morning shift at Murphy's ended at 2, and I'd gotten into the habit of walking to Lincoln Park afterward, not to sit on the bench and wrestle with despair, but to remember. The pond was thawed now, reflecting blue sky and the green haze of new leaves. Ducks had returned, and children fed them bread while their mothers watched from nearby benches. Life continuing. Life insisting on itself despite tragedy and loss, and all the ways the world breaks hearts and tests faith. It was both ordinary and miraculous. This persistence of hope in the face of evidence that hope was often misplaced. I thought about Emma every day, but the thoughts no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. She was part of my story now, part of who I'd become through losing her and learning to live with mystery instead of certainty. Marcus had remarried the previous fall, and I'd attended the wedding, watching him promise to love another woman, while Emma's memory blessed rather than haunted the celebration. She would have wanted this, he'd told me afterward, tears and joy mixing in his voice. And she would have wanted me to love again. Yes, she would have. Emma had been too generous with love to hoard it even in death. The bench where I'd spent so many desperate nights was occupied today by an elderly man feeding pigeons from a paper bag. He nodded as I passed, and I nodded back, two strangers sharing a moment of recognition that needed no explanation. I found another bench, this one facing the children's playground, where laughter mixed with the sounds of traffic and construction from the city beyond. A young father pushed his daughter on a swing while she shrieked with delight, her small hands gripping the chains, as if she could hold on to joy through sheer determination. My phone buzzed with a text from Father Michael. Still interested in leading that Bible study on Thursday nights? We could use someone who's wrestled with the hard questions. I typed back, yes, then added, but I'm going to be honest about not having all the answers. That's exactly why we need you. The sun was warm on my face, and I closed my eyes, feeling something I'd thought was lost forever. Contentment. Not happiness, that would come and go like weather, but the deeper satisfaction of being exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Even if I couldn't see the bigger picture, somewhere in the city, people were suffering as I had suffered, questioning as I had questioned, feeling abandoned by the God they'd been taught to trust. Some of them might find their way to Father Michael's church, or to the park bench, where I'd learned that being found sometimes requires getting completely lost first. I opened my eyes and watched the father lift his daughter from the swing, her small arms wrapping around his neck in perfect trust. She didn't understand gravity or physics or the 1,000 ways the world could hurt her. She only understood that her father's arms were safe, that love was real, that joy was possible. Maybe that was faith, in the end, not having answers but trusting the arms that held you when the questions became too heavy to carry alone. The presence I'd encountered that frozen night was still with me, quieter now but constant, woven into the ordinary moments of washing dishes and walking city streets and learning to love again, despite evidence that love always involved risk. It didn't speak in dramatic revelations anymore, but in the small voice that whispered, "Stay," when I wanted to run, hope when circumstances suggested despair, trust when trust seemed like foolishness. I stood up and started walking home, past the pond where ducks paddled in circles, past the bench where I'd learned that sometimes the deepest faith grows in the darkest soil, past the playground where children learn to fly on swings while their parents learn to let go. Tomorrow, I'd wash more dishes, attend another meeting, prepare for a Bible study where people would ask questions I couldn't fully answer. But tonight, I'd sleep in my small room with the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that Emma was okay, that love was stronger than death and hope more persistent than despair. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on as I reached my building, but I wasn't afraid of the coming darkness. I'd learned that light always returned, sometimes in ways you expected, and sometimes in ways that surprised you completely. And sometimes, when you'd given up looking for it altogether, it found you sitting on a park bench in the middle of the night, broken and empty and ready to receive the kind of love that doesn't depend on your ability to believe in it. That was the miracle in the end. Not that God answered every prayer the way we wanted, but that God kept loving us even when we couldn't love back. Not that faith made everything make sense, but that love made everything bearable, even the questions, especially the questions. I climbed the stairs to my room, keys jingling softly in my pocket, carrying with me the peace that comes from knowing that some mysteries are too beautiful to solve, too sacred to reduce to simple answers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to choose trust over fear. But tonight, I was home, and I was not alone. Dear listeners, we hope David's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.